Hello friends, I hope you're all doing great. Welcome back to another exciting video. I'm Shaquille, and today we're exploring one of the most powerful and defining moments in American history, the Monroe Doctrine of 1823. This bold declaration not only protected the New World from European colonization, but also laid the foundation for U.S. foreign policy that would shape the destiny of the entire hemisphere.
In the early 19th century, the world was undergoing massive changes. The year was 1823, and the United States was still a young nation, only a few decades old after gaining independence. Across the Atlantic, powerful European empires like Spain, Portugal, and even the Holy Alliance, consisting of Russia, Austria, and Prussia, were trying to expand their control and influence. Latin America had recently erupted with revolutions. Nations like Mexico, Colombia, Argentina, and Chile were fighting to break free from Spanish and Portuguese rule, and the United States was watching closely. But there was a serious threat. What if Europe tried to crush these new republics and re-establish its dominance in the Western Hemisphere? For Americans, who had just fought for their own freedom, the idea of European monarchies returning to reclaim lands in the Americas felt like a direct danger, not only to their neighbors, but also to their own independence. At the same time, Great Britain, with its powerful navy, was also interested in preventing Spain from regaining colonies, not out of love for freedom, but to protect its trade and influence. Britain proposed a joint declaration with the U.S. to warn Europe. But President James Monroe, with advice from Secretary of State John Quincy Adams, took a bold decision. Instead of hiding behind Britain, the United States would issue its own statement, making its position clear to the world. Thus, on December 2, 1823, Monroe addressed Congress and laid out what became known as the Monroe Doctrine. The message was simple but powerful. The Americas were no longer open to colonization. Any attempt by European powers to interfere would be considered a threat to U.S. peace and security. At the same time, the U.S. promised not to meddle in European affairs. This declaration was not just a response to immediate threats. It was a turning point in history. It showed that the United States, once a fragile young republic, was beginning to see itself as a protector of freedom in the Western Hemisphere. The stage was set for a new era of American foreign policy, one that would echo for centuries. At the heart of the Monroe Doctrine were a few clear and uncompromising principles that defined the foreign policy of the United States for generations. The first principle was simple: no new colonization in the Americas. Monroe made it crystal clear that the Western Hemisphere was no longer open to European powers seeking to expand their empires. The second principle was non-interference. Monroe declared that European nations must not attempt to influence, control, or intervene in the political affairs of the independent states of the Americas. At the same time, Monroe introduced a third principle: mutual respect. The United States promised it would not interfere in the internal affairs or wars of European nations. Together, these principles created a new reality. The Monroe Doctrine was not just about defending borders, it was about shaping the political destiny of an entire hemisphere. The Monroe Doctrine was more than a diplomatic announcement. It was a bold expression of American identity. In 1823, the United States was still young, fragile, and uncertain in the eyes of many Europeans. Up until then, the U.S. had been cautious, avoiding entanglements with Europe and focusing on its own growth. Yet with the Monroe Doctrine, America moved from silence to confidence. It sent a message that the New World was fundamentally different from the Old World. Europe represented monarchies, empires, and centuries of domination, while the Americas stood for republicanism, liberty, and self-government. Perhaps most importantly, the Monroe Doctrine was a statement of ambition. America was saying, "We may not yet be powerful like Britain or France, but we know who we are, and we know where we stand." One of the most significant dimensions of the Monroe Doctrine was its impact on Latin America. In the early 1820s, the region was undergoing dramatic change. When President Monroe declared in 1823 that the Americas were no longer open to colonization, it was a message of hope and reassurance for Latin America. although the United States at that time did not have the military strength to enforce such a bold statement. The doctrine still carried symbolic weight. In the decades after its declaration, the doctrine became a cornerstone of U.S. diplomacy. For much of the 19th century, it served as a silent guardian, reminding European powers that the Americas were off-limits. Perhaps the most famous reinterpretation came in 1904, under President Theodore Roosevelt. Known as the Roosevelt Corollary, this edition declared that the United States had not only the right to keep Europe out, but also the responsibility to intervene in Latin American nations. The Monroe Doctrine was not only important for the United States and Latin America, it had a profound global significance. At its core, it redefined the balance of power between the Old World and the New World. And that's the story of the Monroe Doctrine. A bold message to the world that the Americas were free, independent, and no longer under the shadow of empires. A turning point that gave the United States its voice on the global stage. Globally, the doctrine also showcased a new kind of leadership. By rejecting European interference, the U.S. positioned itself as the symbolic defender of freedom, even if it lacked the immediate ability to enforce it fully. This vision resonated not only in the Americas, but also in parts of the world struggling against imperial domination. It was an early example of how ideas, like liberty and sovereignty, could be as powerful as armies. Over time, the Monroe Doctrine influenced global diplomacy. European powers had to adjust their strategies, recognizing that the U.S. would resist any attempt to recolonize the Americas. Britain, too, often aligned with the doctrine because it served its own interests in trade and naval supremacy, giving the policy even greater global weight. Perhaps the greatest global significance of the Monroe Doctrine was how it set the stage for America's future role in world affairs. It transformed the U.S. from a young republic into a rising guardian of an entire hemisphere. Later, as America grew stronger, the doctrine's principles evolved into broader claims of leadership, eventually shaping America's role as a global superpower in the 20th century. In essence, the Monroe Doctrine was not just a regional policy. It was a declaration to the world that power was shifting, that new nations were rising, and that the age of European domination in the Western Hemisphere was coming to an end. And that's the story of the Monroe Doctrine, a bold message to the world that the Americas were free, independent, and no longer under the shadow of empires. A turning point that gave the United States its voice on the global stage. If you enjoyed this journey into history, don't forget to hit like, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe for more inspiring chapters from America's past. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.